Now, recently on the internet, everywhere you go, you see the topic of Tiananmen Square on non-political subreddits. Like our pics and our videos, you see people just screaming about Tiananmen Square and spamming it everywhere. And a lot of people, most people know absolutely nothing about Tiananmen Square. Even, a lot of left-leaning people are falling for this whole idea that the Tiananmen Square was this protest. Just wanted simple, basic rights and freedom, and the Chinese government just murdered thousands upon thousands of people. Even some actually believe that they were socialists because they sang a song. They have to be socialists if they sing songs. Well, here I'm going to be using all Western sources because, interestingly enough, the West is honest about Tiananmen Square. I mean, they try and spin it to act as if the Tiananmen Square protesters were the heroes, but if you actually sit down and look at the facts, it does not seem that way at all. What were the goals of Tiananmen Square? Well, it had nothing to do with the workers. Nothing to do with raising their standard of living. One of the leaders argued for pay raises for the intellectuals, not the workers. Were they protesting against the Deng Xiaoping reforms? Again, not necessarily. They were protesting the reforms because there wasn't enough. They cried, "Continue the reforms," as if they weren't enough. One huge thing that the protest leaders were talking about was that they were not trying to overthrow the Communist Party or socialism. They just wanted a dialogue. They just wanted to work with the government.
Away, and they wanted to talk about their constitutional rights.
The aim of dialogue was not to solve everything at once. We wanted to establish some ground rules, open up some channels for communication, so that whenever problems arose, there'd be ways of resolving them. We wanted to lay some foundations for the future. We wanted to make a good start. What we were hoping for was gradual progress, reform, not cataclysmic change, not revolution. Because honestly, in 1989, the situation wasn't so bad that people felt they needed a revolution.
A new path seemed to be opening up. A path leading away from the confrontational politics that had dominated China for decades. The path China had long ago failed to take.
Well, there were certain leaders that emerged from the Tiananmen Square protests. And the documentary, The Gate of Heavenly Peace, which was made by the United States government, Ford and the Rockefellers, interviewed quite a bit of these leaders. Although the film mocks the CPC for believing that the Tiananmen Square protests were some type of conspiracy to undermine the party.
I met someone who had just come from China. He said, "What do you think you can do back there? Haven't you heard about the editorial that just appeared? It calls the movement a plot by a small handful to instigate anti-party, anti-state Dongluan."
Dongluan. Turmoil, upheaval, chaos. A People's Daily editorial denounced the demonstrations. "We must unequivocally oppose Dongluan," the headline read. Once again, a small handful of conspirators were supposedly plotting to bring down the state. Once again, the irrevocable judgment was passed.
The editorial of April 26th caught the students by total surprise. We didn't expect that the government would jump to such a vicious conclusion about us. We felt that without large-scale street action, we couldn't compete with the propaganda machine of the government, and the people wouldn't know the truth about what we were doing.
The Chinese Constitution guarantees the people free speech and the right to demonstrate. But Chinese law punishes counter-revolutionary instigation by the enemies of the people. The final arbiter was the Communist Party. Were the students the people? Or were they now enemies of the people who must be suppressed?
When you get the leaders behind closed doors, that's exactly what they said they were trying to do.
I thought the only workable thing was to join up and try and change it. Committing suicide myself wouldn't do the country much good. A more useful thing to do was to help the Communist Party commit suicide. Lenin had taught us that the easiest way to take a fortress is from within. There's also the Trojan horse in ancient Greece. If you can't win through confrontation, you have to try sneaking inside.
What a student movement represents is a call for social justice. There are times when we have no choice but to take to the streets to express our ideas, vent our anger, and show our determination to change things. April 27th was such a time. The students did a great job, and the government was forced to change its usual behavior. But our ultimate goal is to change the entire system. This cannot be accomplished by students staying in the streets.
I was especially surprised that this documentary included some of the stuff that Ling was saying, one of the top student leaders.
Many students do not understand that the square is our only stronghold. Some people have repeatedly advocated that we leave, but that could only please the government. What makes me really sad is that I am the commander-in-chief, and I can't let go of this power because I must resist compromise, resist these traitors. The leaders of the independent student unions of Beijing and of the provinces are all after my power. I used to believe that we could establish democratic processes, and then a lot of people could use science to really help our country. But now I've come to realize that unless we overthrow this inhuman government, our country will have no hope. Our people will have no hope.
Ling had successfully resisted the proposal to move the struggle back to the campuses and allied herself once more with those determined to hold the square. On the following morning, she contacted American journalist Philip Cunningham.
I have been feeling very sad recently. The students themselves lack a developed sense of democracy. To be honest, from the day I called for a hunger strike, I knew we would not get any results. Certain people, certain causes are bound to fail. I have been very clear about this all along, but I've made an effort to present a staunch image, to show that we were striving for victory. But deep down, I knew it was all futile. The more involved I got, the sadder I became. I already felt this back in April. All along, I've kept it to myself, because being Chinese, I felt I shouldn't badmouth the Chinese. But I can't help thinking sometimes, and I might as well say it. You, the Chinese, you are not worth my struggle. You are not worth my sacrifice. But then, I can also see that in this movement, there are many people who do have a conscience. There are many decent people among the students, workers, citizens, and intellectuals. The students keep asking, what should we do next? What can we accomplish? I feel so sad. Because how can I tell them that what we are actually hoping for is bloodshed? For the moment when the government has no choice but to brazenly butcher the people. Only when the square is awash with blood will the people of China open their eyes. Only then will they really be united. But how can I explain any of this to my fellow students? And what is truly sad is that some students and some famous, well-connected people are working hard to help the government, to prevent it from taking such measures. For the sake of their selfish interests and their private dealings, they are trying to cause our movement to collapse and get us out of the square before the government becomes so desperate that it takes action. If we allow the movement to collapse on its own, then the government will be able to wipe out all the leaders of the movement as well as those leaders in the party and in the military who dare to oppose them, who represent the people. Deng Xiaoping has made it very clear that there is a small handful of people not only in the party and in society, but also among the students. That's why I feel so sad, because I can't say all this to my fellow students. I can't tell them straight out that we must use our blood and our lives to call on the people to rise up. Of course, the students will be willing, but they are still such young children.
And she cries like she's the victim. She knowingly manipulated people and lied to people, but it's her that's the victim. So, not only were they trying to overthrow the Communist Party, but they were lying to everyone about their goals. And you see this because they have a severe hatred of the Chinese masses and the Chinese workers. That's clear from nearly every single leader, proclaiming that the Chinese just aren't smart enough.
I believe that what the Chinese lack is not ideals, but the means through which to realize them. Not courage, but the wisdom necessary to achieve their goal. What the Chinese lack is not a heart, but a mind.
Indeed, this hatred of the masses manifested itself in the form of anti-democracy when it comes to one of the other top leaders, Wang Dan. This man, Wang Dan, was not elected, and they freely admit that.
On the night of April 19th, a new student union was formed at Beijing University. 7 people volunteered to be on the organizing committee. They became the leaders because they were courageous enough to step forward. There were no formal elections. Later, the committee made many efforts to organize elections, but because we constantly faced new crises, we couldn't do what we'd originally intended.
In fact, Wang Dan was an ultra-capitalist, saying the pursuit of wealth is part of the impetus for democracy, and indeed also harbored an extreme hatred of the workers, to the point where he didn't believe in democracy for the workers. The movement is not ready for worker participation because the principles of democracy must first be absorbed by the students and intellectuals before they can spread to others. The limits of democracy. You can't have direct democracy where everyone is electing leaders, that would be a representative democracy, and trying to get involved because it only results in frequent changes of leaders and causes disorder. So for being a leader of a democratic movement, he was radically anti-democratic, unless you were part of the intellectual elite. In another interview, he stated that we need something like a shadow cabinet. We need to come out with a political white paper, how to conduct privatization of land, how to define a new university self-governance law. And this movement loved democracy so much that they had political suppression within their own ranks. The exact thing they were criticizing the Chinese government for, they talked about how they constantly did.
Faced with a territory and a population to govern, the student leaders on the square found themselves recreating in miniature all the real-life problems of having and holding power. External threats of government repression meant enforcing internal security. Disagreements with the leadership were labeled betrayal, sabotage, by the familiar small handful of plotters. Struggles between the groups vying for power in the square grew increasingly ugly.
Once they took control of the broadcast station, they were in power. Often we had to suppress 3 or 4 coups a day. At the time I even joked. Now I finally understand why Li Peng wanted to suppress the students.
Once I made a suggestion to the students. That was around May 23rd. I said, why not hold an election at the square or on your campuses? 1 student, 1 vote, and elect leaders of the student union. But they felt elections were unthinkable in the middle of all that chaos. Then a week later, I heard that the students were setting up a democracy university in the square. I thought, Well, that suggestion of mine was at the level of a democracy kindergarten. You people didn't like it. So now you're setting up a democracy university. But no matter what, you still have to vote.
Now, according to Wikipedia, the Tiananmen Square protests never really surpassed 1 million people. At the time they were clearing the square, there was about 70,000 people in the square. That's out of 1.1 billion people. So, no, this wasn't a mass movement. This was a movement of intellectuals. They received millions upon millions of dollars through Hong Kong in international funds.
我们对香港各界朋友的大力支持首先表示感谢。同时，我们有了这种支持，我们相信我们的信心得到了更大的增强。
And how did you raise the money in Hong Kong?
Many ways. For example, there was one concert for the democracy in China. In that concert alone, 14 million Hong Kong dollars, 14. Was raised, okay, and through other channels, phone in, many channels, through Federation of Student Union in Hong Kong, they raised more than 10 million. So we are talking about quite some money here.
International support suggested the possibility of a real victory for the movement.
And they put it to good use by building a Statue of Liberty. Before we actually get to the events of June 4th, perhaps for some reason you still don't believe that the leaders, group of US-backed capitalists, well, the New York Times did a little "Where Are They Now?" article which followed up on the major leaders of Tiananmen Square. We have the anti-democratic leader Wang Dan, who was arrested and not executed. He served 4 years in prison and then was released. How brutal. After going to jail again, he left for the United States, went to a wealthy university, and is now a privileged college professor. Wu Kai-shi, again, fled to Hong Kong, then to France, then to the United States, and is now an investment banker in Taiwan. Liu Gang, again, fled to the United States, now works in Wall Street. Ling, again, fled to the United States, got a business degree, and became a capitalist. Zhu Fengxiu got a graduate degree in business and works in finance. Li Lu, again, fled to the United States and became a hedge fund manager of a multi-million-dollar company and perhaps had ties to Warren Buffett. Xiaoyang Yan, again, fled to the United States, joined the military, and helped give freedom to the people of Iraq. There seems to be a common theme here. Now, what exactly happened? How does this film talk about the actual events of June 4th? This is a film produced, again, by the Rockefellers, by the Fords, by the United States government. This is not the Chinese government producing this. So, they talk about this is before any shot was fired, before June 4th. They robbed a military bus, and assaulted soldiers.
Army units once again attempted to get to the square. Most of the troops weren't in combat gear, but people were outraged to find that some were actually armed. Protesters confiscated guns, cattle prods, cleavers, and knives, and displayed them as proof that the government intended to use violence. Then they turned the weapons over to the city police. When day came, crowds had stopped buses being used to transport weapons into the city and were ejecting the soldiers.
The documentary doesn't say this, but some of them were indeed burned alive. This was before any shot was fired. at the night of June 4th, things amped up. An armored car drove into the square, and a Molotov cocktail was thrown at it. Again, no gunfire was occurring.
Around 11 o'clock, 2 hours before the main body of the troops arrived, a single armored personnel carrier drove into the square.
Workers and Beijing residents stopped it. Someone hit it with a Molotov cocktail, and it caught fire. The fire hardly slowed it down. Frankly, I was scared and got out of its way. Everyone got out of its way.
The official loudspeakers around the square suddenly came on and announced the emergency orders of the martial law troops. They said that the government was determined to suppress the counter-revolutionary violent rioting at all costs.
Only after the protesters already initiated deadly force did the soldiers respond in kind. In fact, all the video of people getting shot, you can also see that the protesters were throwing Molotov cocktails, a deadly weapon. So after the soldiers put down the frenzied rioters, they opened a dialogue with the students, and the student leaders agreed to end the protests and clear the square. Now, the film mocks with the Chinese government's account of Tiananmen Square that there was no violence within the square itself, but there were rioters around the square who were using deadly weapons and perhaps had firearms on them, and those were the ones who were violently suppressed, not the mass of students within the square itself. They mocked this version of events, and then later confirmed that it's correct.
Almost as soon as the struggle over Tiananmen Square ended, the struggle over the story of what happened there began. The official account was this: no one had died during the clearing of the square at dawn on June 4th. In the approaches to the square, some ruffians who had incited counter-revolutionary violence had been killed, as had a small number of innocent bystanders. The government went to extraordinary lengths to hunt down and punish anyone whose story strayed from the official line.
They quote Ling because we know she's trustworthy, saying that people were being ran over while they were sleeping. But we had another leader of the protests confirm that that was a lie.
Some people said that 200 died in the square, and others claimed that 2,000 died there. There are also stories of tanks in the square running over students who were trying to leave. I have to say that I did not see any of that. I don't know where those people did. I myself was in the square until 6:30 in the morning. I kept thinking, are we going to use lies to attack an enemy who lies? Aren't facts powerful enough? To tell lies against our enemy's lies only satisfies our need to vent our anger. But it's a dangerous thing to do. Maybe your lies will be exposed, and you'll be powerless to fight your enemy.
The Chinese government was correct then in their version of events. And this has been confirmed by linked documents by WikiLeaks. I mean, the Western powers basically admitted it. They claimed the Chinese government was wrong and that they were trying to overthrow socialism in the party. Well, that's clearly false. The documentary itself disproved that. And the documentary then confirms that the CPC was correct in their events that happened in Tiananmen Square. And honestly, what exactly would happen if the Chinese government set up 2,000 satellites to propagate things around Times Square, and students took over Times Square, built a mini terracotta army, assaulted US soldiers, set them on fire, threw Molotov cocktails at army personnel? What exactly would the US government do? What's more, what if all the leaders fled to China and became super wealthy? Do you think that maybe it would have been Chinese-backed if that happened in the United States? You can read the sources yourself, all of them. Every single source I have used has been a Western source, not pro-Chinese, but radically anti-Chinese. So don't believe the nonsense about Tiananmen Square. Stuff like this has happened to countries all across the globe. The United States wants you to focus on China as being the number one enemy, while they overthrow governments, have hundreds and hundreds of military bases overseas, and drone strike children. But no. That doesn't seem to really matter to most people.